obviously, I'm too short to reach the pedals. Who wants to drive these days anyways? I mean, insurance. Where are you gonna go? Everything's closed. If there was one thing that I could drive, it would be a motorcycle. I do think riding a motorcycle would be absolutely thrilling. I suppose that there's a tiny motorcycle out there. Perhaps I should look into it. Borrowing one. If anybody has a tiny motorcycle that's a sea otter or freshwater otter.
Yeah, that reminds me. What are you doing driving around in a car?
Oh, well, I'm the passenger. I'm certainly not driving. I mean, look at me. I'm barely tall enough to see over the dashboard. But life's good. I'm being driven out for an eye exam, and I'm just simply waiting in the car. I do like bicycles, I should say. But again, too short. Now, skateboards. Skateboards are indeed rideable. Seawater or freshwater otter. Now that I'd like to see.
Professor, I was curious if you could explain a little bit about the technology that you're using to communicate with us remotely.
Well, I assure you this. It's not digital, and it's not connected to a cloud network. It's not owned by the utilities. In fact, it's all analog, like old television. Think about that. Old radio. People look at radio nowadays and say, radio. But guess what all your cellular telephones are? Radios, of course. It's radio technology. I mean, yes, really the most ingenious thing is how they connected all the digital stuff to the analog stuff. And they make it all seem like it's all digital. In fact, they've done a pretty fair job of drumming it out of your head that analog radio is anything of value, right? I mean, it's difficult to make a statement like that when your paycheck is partly underwritten by the likes of the big four tech giants. But then you think, well, what about the networks? Are these simply ancestors of Ma Bell? And indeed they are. Alcatel-Lucent, or, I'm trying to think of something. What's the name? Oh, it escapes me. I'd look it up, but I actually don't carry a computer with me. A handheld device. A smartphone. Where would I put it? I'm not a kangaroo, you know.
So what you're saying is that the technology that you use to talk to me right now is analog in nature.
Yes, that's right. It's analog completely. Of course, there are solid-state components like op-amps, resistors. There's a chip or two, but it's not digital. The only time I like to use anything digital is on a Raspberry Pi, or an Arduino, or any of the other maker boards are splendid examples of digital technology with an analog interface that one can experiment with. It's absolutely brilliant. Don't get me wrong. I'm not anti-digital. I'm not anti-anything, really, more or less. I'm not a hater, as they say. I'm simply an open-minded otter, as one should be if one is an otter. I'm an open-minded otter, as one ought to be. Sorry, I promised you no otter jokes. Well, here we are.
Yeah, so what are you doing there?
Well, one of the kind people that cares for me when I'm in a city. Oh, I can't hear myself think in the city, though. It's loud. Anyways, one of my good friends is taking me out for a drive. And it's good to get out. I even have me little mask if I need to walk around. See, there's my mask on. I got it. Oh, safe to walk around. Can breathe the air. Go about my business. Again, blending right in. No problem. No one questions it. In fact, many are simply just slightly afraid. Except for children, of course. They say, we're all in this together. Please look out for each other. Well, is anybody looking out for all the animals? The otters on the street? The token otter? Also, the thing about masks is that they're terribly hot for an otter. I'm all, look at me. I'm covered in fur. I really want to get into the water right now. There's a pool over there, like part of the garden in front of the hotel. With each passing minute, it looks more and more enticing. Sometimes you find otters in the darndest places. They simply have their head shoved into a pool of water to cool off. It's what we love to do. Now and again, you'll find an unruly participant flipping and flapping around, perhaps upside down even. What are you going to ask me?
Professor, I was going to say, what do you like to eat when you're in the city? What do you eat and drink? I mean, you mentioned something about sandwiches. What kind of sandwiches do you like?
Sandwiches? Oh, don't get me started, good sir. Liverwurst. Absolute favorite. Spam. I love spam. Spam anything, actually, to tell you the truth. I like those little Vietnamese sandwiches you can get. Delicious. What else? Sandwiches, you say? Anything from the cafeteria. I love refrigerated sandwiches.
Professor, are you famous at all? Do people like come up to you ever and
No, let me cut you off right there. I say there's some magical thing about this entire experience. I could be out walking around in public, no one seems to care, except those who can really see it, and they understand. I have no problem, but there is a group called the Spotters. You don't need to work too hard to guess what that rhymes with. Of course, there's a lot of imposters out there, and I'm fine with that. It helps take the heat off a little bit. The last thing I want is to be jailed up in some experimental lab. Now, don't get me wrong. Experimenting is important, but not on animals. Not in the way you have done so. So we need to be very clear about that in the open. It's most distressing. You might say, well, what does an otter care about a bunch of monkeys? Plenty, I assure you, plenty.
So you say you're getting an eye exam done today?
Yes, that's the idea. I'm here waiting my turn to have an eye exam. You know, I have a bit of astigmatism. It's common in otters. It's actually fine when we're underwater. No astigmatism whatsoever. Just above land, too long. I think the eyes dry out or something. Not really sure. Might be a worthwhile research topic. Perhaps I can have some of the undergraduate students look into it.
Professor, you mentioned that you're using op amps in your communication hardware. Can you talk about that? Op amps is a topic that I'm quite interested in as far as making circuits and how they work and using them in schematics and solving problems using op amps.
Yes, they're quite useful, first off, obviously. The real keen thing about an op amp is feedback. Now you see a little bit of that when you work with transistors, and an op amp is nothing but a set of transistors. It has a schematic of its own, so that's perhaps building an op amp out of primary components. This is a good way to have a deeper understanding of what an op amp does. And if I was there, of course, I'd move some around on the breadboard with my flippers, turn on a switch, my nose.
Professor, it's always fun to talk about what you had for breakfast today. What did you have for breakfast?
Breakfast. I believe it was a bowl of chowder.
Chowder. You had chowder for breakfast.
Oh yes, chowder and the crackers. I love the chowder and the crackers.
Where do you go to get chowder?
Usually I get my chowder from the school cafeteria. Oh, the cafeteria makes great chowder. Nothing to quibble at.
So you were an Atlantic cod chowder aficionado, or are you more of a halibut?
Oh, I do like halibut, but Atlantic cod is perfectly fine. I mean, it's a natural part of my diet anyways. I'm not going to be picky, certainly. Halibut, though. Also salmon. If you get over to the west coast of the United States, boy, Pacific salmon is excellent. But of course, I shouldn't be saying anything about this. We don't want to be stoking the fires of the... I must be honest with you. A chowder is nothing, absolutely nothing, without the cracker. Now the crackers are curious because they're cheap, and I say the cheaper the better. A great chowder cracker is a Cheez-It. Give me a box of Cheez-Its. I'll go through the trash to find a Cheez-It. I'll paw around in a rubbish tip to find a box of Cheez-Its. Also just plain old saltines. The cheapest fish crackers you can find. Or old breadsticks are great, but they must be crispy, so not too old. A good cracker is defined by its crispiness ratio. I'd be delighted to break down all the properties of a great chowder cracker.
Well, I don't really think we're going to have time to talk to...
Yes, I don't think we have time to go through it now, but suffice it to say, it's about the crunch. Now, in other topics.
Professor, you're also well known for some of your economic views, or some of your views on the economy and as well as like the financial situation. Any good stock tips?
Stock tips. In these times, it's pretty obvious who's winning. And if you didn't see that coming, well, of course you can subscribe to my newsletter. However...
Well, what do you think of things like Bitcoin and so forth?
Absolute rubbish. I'll tell you what, it's deeply personal because to me, money needs to be something I can put into my mouth almost. That money should be 1 or 2 steps removed from my dinner. You talk about things like Bitcoin. Oh, my ride's here. My driver's arrived. Cheerio. Would you like to know what otters use for money?
Money? I hadn't thought that otters would have any use for money.
Oh, of course we have a use for money.
What do you use for money?
We bet. One of the things we use for currency is, now this might sound somewhat odd, but we bet on sardine futures. Now you might ask, what is sardine futures and how do you track it? Sardine futures are any kind of small school of sardines that happens to be going by at that moment or early in the day. And we can quickly tally up a count and we come up with averages over the day and over the weeks and over the seasons and over the years, to the point that it's kind of inbred in us to bet on sardine futures. Not only is it a great food source, but it's a great entertainment. If you're into betting on the stock market, this is no different. It's the same. Sardine futures. Now you say, well, how do you track sardine futures? Oh, quite simple. You just go over to the beach there and find yourself some driftwood and perhaps some pretty stones. It doesn't matter. These are quick games, almost like, what is it in your world? Craps, I believe. It's like a poker match. I'm quite good at poker. I've become quite adept. Another thing that we use for money is actual sardines. We can pass them around. You can sort of carry them around with you a bit, during the course of the day and whatnot. So of course you can claim I'm a hater of such things as digital money and so forth. And that's fine, because, sardine futures is no different. But I say, our games are more like playing craps inside of a McDonald's with actual burgers and fries, in that you're not very far removed from your meal. It's a pretty good close association. Now, freshwater otters, they're rather suburban, shall I say, less urbane than your sea otter. And so part of that is because there's a complacency that one is sort of born into based on the environment. And as you know, the environment of the sea is constantly in flux, much more dramatically than, say, a freshwater lake or some tributary fed by a freshwater river. Not that freshwater otters don't experience their own troubles and blues, but us saltwater types, well, it's in our genes, really. If you were to ask a freshwater otter what they thought of a sea otter, we're a bit closer associated with sharks.